The scent of stale coffee and industrial-grade cleaner was the only thing holding Detective Leo Maxwell's world together. He gripped a cold styrofoam cup, his knuckles white against the rim. Outside the reinforced windows of the Metropolitan Police's Homicide Division, the city was a smear of neon and rain, but inside, the air was still, oppressive. His partner, Detective Anya Sharma, slid a manila folder onto his desk. The cheap paper rustled like dry leaves. The chief wants an update on the Mute Man case, Leo. He's getting pressure from the mayor's office. 3 missing persons now, all vanished from their homes, no forced entry, no struggle. Just, gone. Leo didn't look up. He was staring at the police artist's sketch taped to the divider. It wasn't a sketch of the suspect, but of the victim's last known expression. A wide, frozen look of serene, almost joyful terror. They call him the Mute Man because he leaves no trace, Anya. No calls, no notes, no ransom demands. The only signature is the lack of one. Leo's voice was rough, a piece of gravel caught in his throat. This case was different. It wasn't the brutality that got to him, it was the impossibility that a week ago, during the initial sweep of the second victim's apartment, Leo had felt it. A cold spot that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He'd followed an inexplicable, faint sound, a rhythmic, almost mechanical thump-scrape, down the hallway, past the crime scene tape. It led him to a small, seldom used linen closet that he'd forced the door open. Inside, it was pitch black, smelling of ancient dust and a metallic tang he couldn't place. He'd shone his flashlight in, the beam cutting a hole through the gloom. There was nothing. Just empty shelves and a back wall of cracked, peeling paint, but for one heart-stopping second, before the beam settled, he was certain he'd seen a doorway. A heavy, ornate oak door where a drywall should have been, emblazoned with a tarnished brass plaque. He couldn't make out the words, but the shape was distinct. An impossible door in an impossible place. Anya had called his name then, pulling him back to the reality of flashing evidence tags and forensic technicians. When he turned his light back, it was just the cracked, peeling paint again. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, fatigue, or stress, until this morning that he was driving home, lost in the monotonous grind of the late shift, when he passed the derelict old municipal building on the edge of the city's historic district, a place everyone knew had been condemned for decades. The wrecking ball was supposed to hit it years ago. It was a crumbling skeleton of brick and broken glass. Except, for a fleeting moment, as his headlights washed over its facade, the building wasn't condemned. It was active. The windows were lit from within with a cold, sickly yellow glow. A faded, chipped sign above the main entrance, unreadable in the dark, but undeniably present, read, Metro PD, Precinct 49. Leo slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing on the wet asphalt. He threw the transmission into reverse and backed up, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He stopped, his car now directly across the street from the building, crumbling brick. Broken glass. Condemned. The lights were gone. The sign was a blank, sun-bleached smear. It was a ghost building again. He pulled out his phone, snapped a photo of the derelict shell, and typed out a quick message to Anya, then deleted it. He'd sound unhinged. This Mute Man case was breaking him down, forcing him to see things that weren't there. He started the car, but before he could pull away, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was at a second-story window of the condemned building that a figure stood there, silhouetted against the dark interior. It was tall, impossibly thin, and it wore a police uniform. The kind of uniform they hadn't worn in the Metro PD since the early 80s, and then, the impossible happened. The figure raised its arm, slowly. Deliberately. Its hand, a skeletal shadow, tapped the glass twice. Tap tap, the sound was faint, but in the silence of the rainy street, it was sharp, unnervingly clear. Leo instinctively reached for his sidearm. He was a cop. He had to check. It was his job. He killed the engine and stepped out into the pouring rain. As he crossed the street, he didn't notice the faint, rhythmic sound now accompanying the rain, a familiar, unsettling sound rising from the storm drains at his feet, thump-scrape, thump-scrape. The echo of the walls. He was at the main entrance, pulling on the rusted, peeling handle of the massive, defunct door of the condemned building. He pushed, expecting resistance, expecting to call a crew to secure the scene. Instead, the door groaned inward easily, effortlessly. The brass plaque on the door, freshly polished and gleaming in the reflected streetlight, now read, Precinct 49, EPA. EPA Environmental Protection Agency? No, that didn't make sense. Leo stepped inside. The air was dry, and the metallic tang from the linen closet was overpowering. The interior was pristine, frozen in time. Desks were lined up, typewriters covered with dust sheets, and a faint, electric hum filled the air. This wasn't an abandoned building. It was a functioning police precinct, and then he saw the clock above the sergeant's desk. It wasn't running. The hands were frozen, and the time was 1:13 a.m. The exact time the mute man's first victim had been reported missing. Suddenly, a voice, deep and calm, sliced through the silence of the old precinct. "Can I help you, Detective Maxwell?" Leo spun around, his hand on his Glock. Sitting behind the desk, lit by a single desk lamp, was the silhouette from the window. The tall, thin figure in the outdated uniform. Its face was obscured by shadow and the brim of its police cap. "Who are you?" Leo demanded, his heart now a pneumatic drill in his chest. "This building is condemned." The figure smiled, a slow, unsettling movement that made its face seem to stretch in the dim light. Its voice, when it spoke again, was a dry whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We've been waiting for a patrolman on the mute man case." "You're the one who saw the door, aren't you?" "The ones who see the door, we call them compromised." "You have a case file for us, detective." "Bring it in. The reports need to be filed on the other side." The figure gestured toward an archway behind the desk. Beyond it was only absolute, light-devouring blackness. Leo felt the cold, hard certainty of a trap closing around him. He took a hesitant step back, his eyes locked on the officer. "What is the other side?" The officer stood up, and Leo finally saw its face. Or rather, the absence of one. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, unmarked skin, like stretched, sun-baked clay, with a single, perfectly stitched vertical seam running from the top of its forehead to the collar of the uniform. The thing tilted its head. "It's where the evidence goes, detective. And it's where the missing are kept." The air in Precinct 49 was thick, tasting of rust and old copper. Leo's finger tightened on the trigger guard of his Glock. The faceless officer, the seam man, as Leo's subconscious instantly named it, stood perfectly still, a sentinel of impossible dread, its stitched face tilted in an expression that was somehow simultaneously patient and menacing. "I need to see identification," Leo demanded, the command thin and reedy in the sudden silence. He knew it was futile, a last, desperate attempt to apply the logic of his world to this horrifying anomaly. The seam man didn't move a muscle, yet Leo felt a response as clear as a shout. "We are beyond your rules, detective. The missing don't stay missing forever," the seam man whispered, the voice resonating from the hollow chest of its uniform. "But their files must be accurate. The compromised always hold the key." The word compromised struck Leo like a physical blow. He wasn't compromised by corruption or failure, he was compromised by sight. He had seen the door in the closet, and he had seen the light in the abandoned building. Leo lowered his weapon slightly. He had to know. Walking away meant condemning the mute man's victims to this terrifying void. He had to gather intelligence, even if it meant stepping into the heart of the nightmare. The case file is back at Metro PD, Leo lied, testing the limits of this entity's knowledge. The seam-man slowly raised its hand. Not the skeletal hand Leo had seen in the window, but a perfectly gloved, unervingly white hand. It pointed directly at Leo's chest, specifically at the hidden inside pocket of his jacket. No, detective. The true file. The one you keep in your memory. The silence that followed was broken by the rhythmic thump-scrape, now louder, echoing from the darkened archway behind the desk. It sounded like heavy boots dragging a piece of rusted metal across concrete. Fine, Leo grit out. He wasn't leaving his gun. Show me where to file. Where are your partners? Where is your intake officer? The seam-man's outstretched hand gestured again toward the black archway. They are working. They have their own cases. You are here for the mute man. Follow the echo, detective. Follow the echo to the records room. With an unnatural, gliding movement, the seam-man turned and stepped around the massive, mahogany sergeant's desk. As it moved, Leo noticed a stark contrast. While the rest of the precinct was spotless, the desk's surface was coated in a thin, greasy layer of black dust that seemed to absorb all light. Leo took a deep breath, the metallic smell burning his nostrils. He holstered his Glock but kept his hand hovering near the grip. He stepped past the desk and into the archway. It wasn't a room on the other side. It was a corridor, unlit, extending into the abyss. The air immediately dropped 10 degrees, and the floor felt strange under his polished leather shoes, like walking on slightly sticky, damp slate. The thump-scrape was now deafening. He followed the sound, his flashlight beam shaky, fighting against the consuming darkness. The walls of this corridor were lined floor to ceiling with metal filing cabinets, not the beige office type, but heavy, battleship gray drawers, all numbered and labeled with brittle, yellowed tape. Homicide. Missing persons. Cold cases. Unidentified. He ran his hand along the cold metal. There were thousands of drawers. An entire archive of the lost. He stopped when the corridor opened into a vast, cavernous room, the records room. The walls here were not lined with cabinets, but with thousands upon thousands of small, circular holes, like a vast honeycomb. From each hole, a single piece of paper, tightly rolled like a scroll, protruded a few inches. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single, bare bulb dangling from a thick wire, was the source of the sound. A figure, also in the outdated police uniform, but hunched and grotesquely large, was operating a massive, archaic machine. It looked like a cross between an iron lung and an oversized industrial grinder. The figure had a face, a deeply scarred, swollen face, but it was covered by thick, opaque black safety goggles. It was feeding something into the machine. With every thump, the grinder's iron plunger slammed down. With every scrape, the gears turned, spitting out a thin, grayish powder into a waiting steel basin. Leo realized what the figure was feeding the machine: files. Not paper. It was feeding thick, old, leather-bound police binders, each one stamped with the Metro PD seal. He watched in horror as the figure grabbed a large, crimson binder labeled Vance, R., the name of the first victim in the Mute Man case. It tossed the binder into the hopper. Thump-scrape, the sound echoed through the terrifying space. The binder was gone, reduced to ash. The figure turned its scarred face toward Leo. The black goggles reflected the single light bulb like two alien eyes. The evidence must be processed, detective, the figure wheezed, its voice sounding like grinding stone. To make room for the transfer. You need to file your findings before the transfer is complete. Leo found his voice, edged with disbelief. Transfer? What transfer? You're destroying active files. The figure pointed a thick, gloved finger at the thousands of scrolls protruding from the wall. Those aren't just files, detective. They are memories. The records of why they were chosen. When a victim is taken by the mute man, their memory, their being, is compressed and stored here. Their file is destroyed to make room for the physical body to be transferred. To where? To the other side. Where they can be utilized. The figure leaned closer, the smell of burnt metal and stale blood overwhelming. You have seen the door. You are compromised. You are the final piece of the report, Detective Maxwell. Tell me what the mute man wants. Tell me the core of the file so we can complete the processing and make the final transfer. As the figure spoke, Leo felt a strange, cold pressure building behind his eyes. He realized the true horror of the seam man's words. They didn't want the notes on his desk, they wanted the psychological toll the mute man had taken on him. They wanted the fear, the confusion, the obsessive need to solve the impossible case. That was the true file. The evidence of his own descent. Leo needed to escape, but he knew he couldn't just walk out. He had to fight the core premise of this mirror precinct. That he looked at the machine, then at the piles of gray ash, the pulverized memories of the missing. He knew he had to stop the processing, or the mute man would claim his third victim completely. Leo took one last, desperate look at the large figure operating the machine. He saw, tucked into the figure's belt, a standard issue, red-handled box cutter, the kind the Metro PD uses for cutting crime scene tape. It was a mundane object in this realm of cosmic horror. And that made it the only piece of truth he could hold on to. The mute man, Leo began, forcing the words past the paralyzing fear. He wants, what every monster wants. Silence. As he spoke, he drew his Glock, not aiming at the figure, but at the single, bare light bulb above the grinding machine. Leo raised the Glock, the heavy steel warm and solid in his grip, a tiny beacon of his reality in this impossible, frozen place. He aimed just above the massive, goggle-faced figure, the grinder man, at the single bare light bulb. He didn't want to engage the entity directly unless he absolutely had to. He needed chaos. He needed a distraction. Blam, the sound of the gunshot in the enclosed space was an ear-splitting, physical shockwave. The bulb shattered, plunging the vast records room into absolute, light-devouring blackness. Tiny shards of glass rained down, mixing with the cold, greasy dust. The thump scrape immediately stopped. Leo dropped into a tactical crouch behind a stack of rusted metal cabinets. His mind raced. He had precious seconds before his eyes adjusted, and before the grinder man or the seam man could react. The metallic smell intensified, now laced with ozone and the raw, electrical scent of a short circuit. A slow, grinding moan erupted from the center of the room. It wasn't the machine, it was the grinder man. The report, the processing is incomplete. The wheezing voice echoed, disoriented. The transfer, the file is not finalized. Leo flicked on the tactical light mounted to his Glock, cutting a narrow, intense beam through the darkness. It was a mistake. The beam landed directly on the grinder man. The figure was standing motionless, its massive body shaking slightly. The black goggles reflected the flashlight beam back, creating two angry, burning pinpricks of light. But the goggles had slipped slightly on the figure's face, revealing the skin beneath. It was not scars, but intricate, overlapping layers of human teeth, fused together like grotesque white armor. The horror of the mute man's ultimate objective, silence, clicked into Leo's mind. The mute man didn't just kill, he destroyed the victim's ability to speak, to scream, to bear witness. The victims were becoming the material for the horrors of Precinct 49. Leo scanned the area frantically, looking for the red-handled box cutter he'd seen earlier. He needed to disable the machine, To stop the transfer of the third victim, the grinder man lunged. It didn't run, it simply took one impossible, stretching step that covered half the distance of the room. Its hands, thick and spatulate, swiped at the air where Leo had been. Leo rolled sideways, coming up against a wall of filing cabinets. The impact sent a cascade of rusty dust raining down. He swung his light around and found the machine again. The red-handled box cutter was lying on a shelf attached to the grinder's hopper. "You said silence," the grinder man rasped, its voice full of agonizing effort. "Silence is order. Order is law. You are bringing noise, Detective Maxwell. And noise must be filed away." Leo ignored the monstrous figure. He sprinted toward the machine, keeping the light trained on the box cutter. The grinder man was turning, its heavy boots thumping against the floor, struggling to locate the source of the light. As Leo reached the machine, he snatched the box cutter. It was cold, unnaturally so, but familiar. He jammed the light onto a nearby ledge, focusing its beam onto the grinder's main power cable, a thick, braided black wire running into the floor. "Stop!" roared the grinder man. The sheer volume of the voice was enough to make Leo's ears ring. Leo didn't hesitate. He jammed the razor-sharp edge of the box cutter against the cable and sliced down with all his force. The blade bit deep. Sparks erupted in a blinding, violet shower, illuminating the entire room for a split second. Leo saw the full horror of the vast honeycomb wall, every rolled scroll vibrating violently. He saw the grinder man, eyes burning through the slip of the goggles, lunging with terrifying speed. Then, total darkness and total silence. The electricity was dead. The hum of the strange, timeless precinct had vanished. Even the thumbscrape was gone. Leo held his breath, the metallic tang of the dead power mixing with the pervasive, coppery odor. He could hear nothing but the frantic pounding of his own heart. "It's over. I stopped it." A voice, calmer, colder than the grinder man's wheeze, spoke from the archway behind him. "The seam man, you've damaged the infrastructure, Detective. Not the record." Leo spun around, his light cutting through the absolute dark. The seam man was standing exactly where it had been before, an unmoving shadow. "The transfer is complete," the seam man continued, a note of cold finality in its voice. "Your disruption only solidified the finality. The memory of the third victim is fully compressed. The body is now scheduled for utilization." Leo felt a cold dread that surpassed the fear of death. He hadn't saved anyone, he had merely hastened the process. The seam man took a step forward, and Leo noticed the light source that had been illuminating the sergeant's desk in Part 1 was now attached to the seam man's chest, a small, dull yellow badge. The badge was now pulsing with a faint, steady rhythm, pulsing. "Not electric." "You are still compromised, Detective," the seam man said. "And you are now a witness. Witnesses must be filed. You saw the door, you saw the method, and you saw the true cost of silence." Leo raised the Glock, aiming at the pulsing yellow badge, the point of light in the darkness. "I'm leaving," Leo stated, his voice ringing with forced conviction. "And I'm coming back with my department." The seam man let out a soundless laugh, a terrifying, shuddering motion of its stitched head. "You are already in your department, Detective. This is Precinct 49. EPA. The seam man tilted its head, and the light on its chest pulsed brighter. "It stands for Eternal Police Archive. And you just filed yourself under cold case, Maxwell." As the seam man lunged, an alarm blared, not from inside the precinct, but from the pocket of Leo's own jacket, his Metro PD radio, shrieking with static and the voice of Anya Sharma. "Leo. Where are you? The GPS put you at the old municipal building, but the building is gone. It's just an empty lot." "Leo, answer me. The seam man stopped its lunge, its stitched face turning toward the sound of the outside world, a flicker of what Leo could only describe as annoyance crossing its unface. Leo used the precious second of distraction, not to fire, but to sprint back the way he came, out of the darkness and toward the sergeant's desk. He had to get to the door. The shriek of Anya's voice blasting from his police radio was the only lifeline Leo had. It was the sound of his reality tearing through the fabric of the eternal police archive. Leo, answer me, the radio crackled again, thick with static. The seam man, still holding its posture of cold annoyance, turned its attention back to Leo, its badge pulsing faster, the light intensifying to a sickly, dangerous yellow. The noise is disrupting the equilibrium, the seam man hissed. You must be silenced now. Leo didn't waste time shooting. He shoved the Glock back into his holster and sprinted, guided by the memory of the light switch and the single oak door. He felt the immense, cold presence of the seam man behind him, closing the distance with unnatural speed. He burst out of the dark records room and vaulted over the sergeant's desk, not bothering to stop. He could hear the heavy, gliding footsteps closing in. He reached the heavy, ornate oak door of Precinct 49. His hand found the cold brass handle. He twisted it, throwing his shoulder against the wood. The door swung outward easily, just as it had swung inward. Leo plunged out into the street. The transition was instantaneous and jarring. The overwhelming metallic odor was replaced by the clean, sharp smell of ozone and wet asphalt. The sickly yellow light of the precinct was replaced by the harsh, flashing blue and red of a police cruiser parked diagonally across the street. Anya Sharma was standing next to her cruiser, soaked to the bone, her flashlight beam frantic. Leo! What the hell is wrong with you? She yelled, running toward him. Leo stood panting, his lungs burning, the image of the seam man's stitched face and the grinder man's tooth-plated face burned into his vision. He spun back, ready to warn Anya away from the impossible building, but there was no building. Where the towering, brick facade of Precinct 49 had stood moments ago, where the massive oak door had just admitted him, was only an empty lot. A crumbling slab of concrete, overgrown with weeds and crisscrossed with yellow do not cross tape, indicating a site condemned and scheduled for demolition. He hadn't stepped out of a precinct, he had stepped out of nothing. Anya reached him, grabbing his arm. Her touch, warm and real, was a dizzying shock. Your GPS was going crazy, she said, her voice tight with fear and anger. It placed you here, then the signal dropped. I was about to call the SWAT team. You look like you just saw a ghost, Leo. Leo's mind struggled to reconcile the physical impossibility. He looked down at his shoes. They were covered in thick, black, greasy dust, the same substance covering the sergeant's desk. He looked back at the empty lot. Anya, I was in there. I saw it. It was a precinct. It was functional. Leo, look, she said, shining her powerful flashlight over the concrete slab. It's an abandoned demolition site. The building was torn down 15 years ago. You're exhausted. That mute man case is messing with your head. Leo pushed past her, running toward the empty lot. He searched frantically for the oak door, for the shining brass plaque, for any remnant of the structure. Nothing. Just rubble and weeds. Then, his flashlight beam caught something. Lying half-buried in the mud near the perimeter tape.it was a small, square, slightly tarnished brass plaque. He snatched it up, wiping the mud away with a shaking hand. The rain made the inscription gleam faintly. It read, Precinct 49, E.P.A. He shoved it into Anya's hand. Tell me I'm tired. Tell me I'm crazy. What is this, Anya? Where did this come from? Anya stared at the plaque, her expression shifting from relief to deep confusion. She turned it over and over, examining the old, heavy brass. I don't know, Leo. I've never seen anything like it. It looks genuinely old. Where did you find it? I found it right where the door was, Leo insisted. Before Anya could respond, her radio crackled, interrupting the intense moment. Attention, all units. We have a confirmed 9 to 11 at 1230 Cypress Lane. Caller reports a person down. Suspect is unknown, but the victim is the mute man's third target. He's been found. The third victim. The one Leo had just seen, processed, in Precinct 49. Leo stared at the brass plaque in Anya's hand. The transfer was complete. The memory was filed. Now, the body was scheduled for utilization. They sped toward Cypress Lane, sirens cutting through the night. Leo didn't tell Anya about the seam man or the grinder man. He focused on the immediate, tangible crime. When they arrived, the scene was calm, unnervingly so. The victim was inside his apartment, lying on the kitchen floor. He wasn't dead, but he was in a state of catatonic shock. The paramedics were stabilizing him. Leo and Anya immediately noticed the anomaly. The victim was clean, unharmed, dressed in the clothes he was reported missing in, but there was one thing wrong. Leo knelt beside the victim. The man's face held the same serene, terrifying look of joyful shock Leo had seen in the initial police sketches. And then Leo noticed the victim's mouth. The lips were cracked and dry, but completely sealed. Not stitched, sealed. As if the moisture and saliva of the mouth had evaporated, and the skin had fused together over the last week. The paramedics tried to pry the mouth open to check the airway, but the skin was hard, like dried leather, completely fused. The victim was alive. But he could never speak again. He was truly mute. Leo's eyes locked onto something lying on the kitchen counter next to the sealed victim. It was a standard issue, red-handled box cutter. The same kind he had used to cut the power cable in Precinct 49. Underneath the box cutter, neatly folded, was a single, pristine piece of paper. It was a standard Metro PD form, a missing person closeout report. Leo picked it up. He scanned the fields: victim name, date reported, date found. All filled in. At the bottom of the form, in the space reserved for the arresting or locating officer, was a signature in elegant, flowing script that looked like tarnished brass. The signature read, S.M. Archive. Leo looked back at the sealed victim, at the box cutter, and finally at the brass plaque heavy in his own jacket pocket. That he was compromised. He was the only one who knew the truth. The mute man wasn't the killer. The mute man was the tool. The killer was the eternal police archive. And they had just used his box cutter to complete their file. Leo stood over the third victim, the neatly signed missing person closeout report crisp in his hand, the paper feeling unnaturally cold. The red-handled box cutter lay beside it, a stark, undeniable piece of evidence that tied him to the supernatural crime scene. Anya, staring at the sealed mouth of the victim, finally spoke, her voice hushed with revulsion. My God, Leo. This isn't just a kidnapping. This is an atrocity. Who does this? Why the box cutter? Leo carefully placed the closeout report into an evidence bag, but kept the brass plaque from Precinct 49 tucked deep inside his jacket. It's a signature, Anya, Leo said, forcing the words out. A way of ensuring silence. The mute man doesn't want witnesses. He makes the victims part of the silence. He avoided looking at her, knowing the frantic terror in his eyes would betray the truth, that the box cutter wasn't the mute man's tool, but the archives, and that he was the one who had provided the means of the final sealing. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was a dizzying return to normalcy. Fluorescent lights hummed, phones rang, and the scent of stale coffee reigned supreme. This was the real world. the world of procedure and concrete facts. But Leo's world had been irrevocably cleaved in two. He sat at his desk, staring at the brass plaque, Precinct 49, EP, now sealed in a Ziploc bag and hidden in the deepest drawer of his filing cabinet. The seam man had called him compromised. That meant he was a person of interest to them. He couldn't trust his own files, his own desk, maybe not even his own memory. Anya came over, slamming a thick history book onto his desk. "I called the city records office," she said, her voice low and serious. "The old municipal building?" It was Precinct 49. It was decommissioned in 1983. They closed it after a massive fire destroyed the records room. And guess what the old police code for that jurisdiction was? She opened the book to a dog-eared page showing an aerial photo of the old building. Metro PD, EPA. Leo looked up, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. EPA? Environmental Protection Agency? No, Anya shook her head. They used the old city codes back then. It stood for Emergency Processing Annex. It was a temporary holding site for files and evidence before they could be fully archived downtown. The fire in '83 was a huge loss of data. Emergency Processing Annex. The seam man had told him Eternal Police Archive. Leo ran his hands through his hair, the puzzle clicking into a terrifying alignment. The entity wasn't just haunting the old precinct, it was reconstituting it, using the old structure and codes as a foundation for its supernatural filing system. The fire that destroyed the emergency annex had created the Eternal Archive. "Anya," Leo said, leaning in, dropping his voice to a whisper. "Did the records clerk say anything else about the fire? About who was lost?" Anya consulted her notes. Only that the official report was classified. But they did mention the responding officers described the scene as impossibly contained. They found the bodies of 2 officers. One was Chief Supervisor Vance, and the other was an evidence processing officer named Elias Grimes. Vance. The name on the crimson file the grinder man was feeding the machine. The first mute man victim's file, Elias Grimes. Evidence processing officer. The grinder man. The Eternal Police Archive wasn't just processing victims, it was processing the guilt and failure of the original precinct. It was a hell built on incomplete paperwork. "We have to go to the main archives," Leo said decisively. "The true downtown archive. If they're using old names and codes, there might be a physical file on the Precinct 49 fire that was overlooked, something that details what they were actually processing that night." Anya nodded, relieved to have a concrete, procedural direction. "I'll get a warrant request in. We'll go tonight." As Anya walked away, Leo opened his laptop, but instead of the warrant request, he brought up a blank Word document. He couldn't trust his notes. He couldn't even trust the recording devices on his person. He started typing, creating a hidden, digital, compromised file. Case notes, the mute man/EPA. The mute man is not a singular person. It is a method of acquisition used by the EPA entity. The EPA, Eternal Police Archive/Precinct 49, is a psychic manifestation that appears only to compromised officers, those who internalize the failure of the case. Entity 1, Seam Man Archivist. Manager. Responsible for the initial file review and classifying the new victim. Entity 2, Grinder Man/Grimes Processor. Responsible for the physical memory compression, turning files/memories to ash, and scheduling the transfer, the sealing of the mouth. The EPA needs the memory of the case to be destroyed to complete the victim's silence. My intervention has made me a central part of their record. They used my box cutter. I am now officially on their ledger. Leo suddenly stopped typing. A cold shadow fell over his desk and he looked up. Sitting in the visitor's chair across from him was the chief of the homicide division, his face expressionless. The chief rarely came onto the floor this late. "Maxwell," the chief said, his voice quiet. "That closeout report you filed on the Cypress Lane victim. I've reviewed it. It's pristine. Good work." "Thank you, Chief," Leo replied, closing his laptop slightly. The chief leaned forward, his gaze unervingly steady. "But I did notice something, Detective. You closed the case, but you filed no evidence from the scene." Leo felt a spike of panic. "The brass plaque." "Sir, the scene was minimal. The priority was the victim's health." "Minimal, yes," the chief interrupted smoothly. "But no one is perfect, Maxwell. You left a small piece of trash on the counter. We recovered it. It was a tiny plastic bag. Ziploc brand. Empty." Leo's blood ran cold. He had put the brass plaque in a Ziploc bag, which was now in his hidden drawer. The chief smiled, a slow, unnatural widening of his eyes that reminded Leo sickeningly of the stretching skin of the seam man. "Don't worry, Detective. I took the liberty of filing it for you. You can't leave trash in the archive, can you? It pollutes the record." The chief stood up, his uniform pressing against his broad frame. As he turned to leave, he paused and glanced at Leo's drawer where the brass plaque should have been. "Just remember, Maxwell," the chief said, his voice dropping to a familiar, cold whisper. "Silence is order. Order is law. And the best archives are always complete." Leo watched the chief walk away. He didn't need to check his drawer. The chief was gone, and so was the Ziploc bag containing the brass plaque. The EPA was not confined to the empty lot. It was already inside the Metropolitan Police Department. The atmosphere in the Metropolitan Police Archives was heavy with the smell of aging paper, ozone, and institutional neglect. It was midnight, and the only sound was the low, consistent hum of the climate control system, a sound that, to Leo's frayed nerves, was beginning to sound suspiciously like a faint, distant thumbscrape. Anya scanned the requested fire report on a microfiche reader, her brow furrowed in concentration. Leo, however, couldn't focus on the file details. His gaze kept drifting to the ceiling and the long, dark rows of archived evidence boxes. The chief's chilling pronouncement, "the best archives are always complete," played on an endless loop in his mind. The seam man had successfully retrieved the brass plaque, using the chief as an unwilling, unconscious vessel. The EPA was using the real police force as its collection agency. "Got something, Leo," Anya whispered, tapping the microfiche screen. "The original report on the '83 fire at Precinct 49. It confirms the deaths of Chief Supervisor Vance and Officer Elias Grimes. But look at the evidence log." Leo leaned in. The log listed massive material loss, thousands of files, evidence, and personal effects destroyed. But under the heading, "Salvaged Items," there were 3 listings. Item 1, sealed police report, signed by Supervisor Vance. Content unknown. Item 2, 1, brass plaque, inscribed EPA, destroyed due to contamination. Item 3, 1, large iron grinder, industrial model, found fused to the floor of the records room. Disposition, scrapped. "Wait," Leo said, his voice catching. "They salvaged the brass plaque and then destroyed it? And they called the grinder man's machine an industrial grinder?" "It makes sense, Leo," Anya said, trying to rationalize. "It was an old facility. They probably had to destroy contaminated brass. And grinder sounds like standard industrial equipment. What's bothering you? The sealed report, Leo insisted, tapping the screen. Why would one single report be sealed and salvaged from an archive fire? And why is its content unknown? It should have been logged. Leo stood up, his gaze sweeping over the rows of beige filing cabinets and boxes stacked to the ceiling. Anya, we're looking in the wrong place. We need to find that report. The one the fire didn't take. The report that started all of this. They spent the next hour manually sifting through the fire incident boxes, their gloved hands covered in the fine, dry dust of decades-old soot. Every time Leo's hand brushed against a filing box, he expected the heavy, metallic tang of Precinct 49 to rush out. Finally, in a box labeled P49 Decom Incident, Miscellaneous Remnants, Anya found it wasn't a file folder. It was a document, rolled and secured with a piece of brittle, red crime scene tape, just as the scene man had described the victim memories in the honeycomb wall. The report was yellowed with age, but the ink was remarkably preserved. The header was simple, Final Closure Report, Jurisdiction EPA. Leo carefully unrolled it. The document was a single, densely typed page detailing the events leading up to the 1983 fire. The report detailed an administrative panic. Precinct 49 was not an annex, but a covert facility created to house failed undercover operations and evidence that was deemed too psychologically damaging to integrate into the main archive. Leo's eyes jumped to the signature line. It was signed, officially, by Chief Supervisor Robert Vance. They were archiving the unarchivable, Leo muttered, his heart sinking. They weren't storing files, they were storing trauma. And when the system failed, the trauma took on a life of its own. He scanned the body of the report, looking for the crucial piece of information, and then he found it, halfway down the page, typed in bold, panic text. The material contained in the annex has begun demonstrating cognitive dissonance. The evidence is manifesting physical properties, specifically auditory and visual feedback that contradicts the established record. Personnel are experiencing debilitating paranoia. Supervisor Vance has determined that the only way to contain the spread of this archival consciousness is to initiate a protocol of silence. All personnel related to the P49 incident must be subjected to a final closure, ensuring that no narrative leaks into the active Metro PD system. Leo looked at Anya, whose face was pale under the dim light of the archive. The protocol of silence, Leo breathed. That's what the mute man is. It's not a killer, it's a protocol. The EPA is just finishing the job that Chief Vance started in 1983. Anya pointed to the margin next to the protocol of silence text. A handwritten note was scrawled in faint pencil, barely visible. Vance is wrong. The silence won't stop it. It will make it stronger. I am the only one who can keep the noise out. E.g., Grimes, the grinder man, wasn't just processing files, he was processing the noise, the memories, the trauma, the narratives, to keep the EPA contained, to prevent the archival consciousness from spreading. Leo quickly snapped photos of the entire report with his phone. He had to get this information out of the archive. We have to go, Leo whispered. We know enough to connect the dots. The EPA is hunting down anyone who generates a noise around failed police procedures. Vance tried to stop it with silence, and now he's the chief entity's file. As they were quickly rolling the report back up, a new sound cut through the silence of the archive. Not the hum of the cooling system, but a distinct, measured click. They looked up. The emergency exit door at the far end of the archive, secured by a heavy magnetic lock, had just clicked open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the weak hallway light. It was tall, impossibly thin, and it wore the outdated, high-collared police uniform. The semiotician didn't glide this time. It simply stood there, blocking their only exit, its stitched head perfectly motionless. "Detective Maxwell," the seaman's voice echoed, cold and clear. "The report is complete. You have filed the final documentation. The archive is now full." Leo pulled his Glock, aiming through the aisles of boxes. "Stay back." The seaman took a slow step forward. "The compromised file is now closed. But before the transfer, you have one last procedure. You must deliver your partner." It raised its gloved hand, pointing past Leo, directly at Anya. "Officer Sharma has generated too much noise," the seaman stated. "Her involvement pollutes the archive. She is scheduled for processing." The seaman's demand hung heavy in the stale, archive air. "She is scheduled for processing." Leo didn't hesitate. He swung his body to shield Anya and brought his Glock up, aiming squarely at the seaman's chest, at the exact spot where the pulsing yellow badge had been on the previous night. "Get behind me, Anya," Leo ordered, his voice raw with adrenaline. Anya didn't argue. She shoved the rolled final closure report into Leo's jacket pocket and fumbled for her own sidearm. "This is not a containment operation, Maxwell," the seaman hissed, its voice echoing oddly off the rows of file boxes. "This is a closure. The noise must be silenced. Your loyalty to Officer Sharma is a variable we must eliminate." Leo fired. Blam! The bullet slammed into the seaman's chest. There was no blood, no injury. Instead, the force of the impact caused a localized disturbance. A shower of thin, brittle, yellowed paper scraps exploded outward from the point of impact, settling quickly on the floor. "It's not flesh and blood," Anya yelled. "It's a structure. Like a paper doll." The seaman didn't flinch. It took a long, unnervingly smooth step forward, gliding past a row of metal cabinets. "You waste your ammunition on the record, detective," the seaman stated. "The record is static. The noise is live." The seaman raised its hand, pointing a perfectly gloved finger at Anya. As it did so, the long, dark aisles of the archive seemed to deepen, the rows of cabinets warping slightly, drawing Leo's eye toward the empty, cavernous space. Leo realized the danger wasn't the entity itself, but the space it commanded. It was trying to impose the geometric impossibility of Precinct 49 onto the real-world archive. "We can't outrun it, Leo," Anya shouted, her eyes darting between the gliding figure and the secured doors. Leo remembered the grinder man and the core function of the EPA, filing. "We changed the file, Anya. Give it something else to process." Leo yelled that he grabbed a heavy, metal-cased fire extinguisher from the nearest wall mount. He didn't aim at the seaman. He aimed at the closest row of cabinets, a row labeled, "Cold Cases, 1970s. If we can't delete the record, we pollute it." Leo slammed the fire extinguisher against the lock of the cabinet. The metal shrieked and bent, but the lock held. The seaman was 2 rows away now, its pace steady and implacable. "The integrity of the record is paramount," the seaman shrieked, its composure cracking for the first time. The stitched seam running down its face seemed to pull taut, momentarily contorting the smooth, featureless surface. Leo looked around desperately. He needed to create an explosion of a noise. His eyes fell on a thick, knotted bundle of electrical wiring hanging loosely from the ceiling, old alarm infrastructure left over from a previous renovation. "Anya! Draw its attention." Anya knew exactly what Leo needed. Without hesitation, she drew her weapon, aiming not at the seaman, but at the main power distribution box high on the wall, visible through a small gap between the cabinets. She was aiming for the physical embodiment of noise, the flow of energy, the antithesis of silence. Blam. Blam! 2 shots from Anya's gun slammed into the power box. Sparks flew, the lights flickered violently, and a siren inside the box began to wail, a shrill, piercing noise that made Leo's teeth ache. The seam man recoiled, the sound clearly agonizing to the entity. It stopped its advance, its form wavering in the flickering light. Contamination. Noise contamination, the seam man screamed, its voice now distorted, sounding like 1,000 sheets of paper being torn simultaneously. Leo seized the opportunity. He vaulted onto a nearby shelf, scrambling up towards the thick bundle of wires, the wailing siren masking his movement. He pulled his box cutter, the same red-handled tool the EPA had used to seal its victim, from his pocket that he sawed frantically at the thickest cluster of wires. One by one, the cables snapped, sending small showers of blue sparks into the air. Finally, the main bundle severed, the entire archive was plunged into complete, sudden darkness. The siren died instantly, but Leo's action had the desired effect. It had triggered the archive's protocol. Immediately, the automatic fire suppression system activated. Not water, but an ancient chemical sealant, thick and viscous, designed to preserve the paper records by starving the air of oxygen. The sealant erupted from nozzles in the ceiling, a sticky, cloying foam filling the air with a blinding, oily mist. "This way!" Leo yelled, grabbing Anya's arm and pulling her toward the magnetic lock door, the exit the seam man had entered through. The seam man, blinded by the darkness and the chemical foam, was thrashing, its paper-thin body struggling against the thick, oppressive sealant. "You cannot escape the file. The final report is always filed," the seam man roared, but the sound was muffled, choked by the foam. Leo and Anya reached the door. The magnetic lock was still released from the seam man's entry. They burst into the hallway, leaving the chemical deluge and the raging entity behind them. They didn't stop until they were outside, leaning against Anya's unmarked car, gasping for the cool night air. They were soaked in the sticky chemical foam, their clothes stained. "We need to get this off," Anya choked out, wiping the sealant from her eyes. "This stuff is toxic." "Not as toxic as what's inside," Leo said, leaning his forehead against the cold metal of the car, the physical world feeling unstable. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the ancient, rolled final closure report. He had saved the report, but he had also provided the EPA with an immense amount of noise to process. As he looked up, the adrenaline fading, he saw a police cruiser glide to a stop at the end of the street. It was the chief's personal car, and standing beside it, silhouetted in the sodium vapor streetlights, was the chief himself, perfectly dry, perfectly composed. He hadn't followed them out. He was waiting for them. The chief didn't shout. He simply held up an object, a small, square piece of glistening, chemical-soaked brass, the EPA plaque. He had recovered it. "Detectives," the chief called out, his voice calm, carrying across the empty street. "I've filed the report on the power outage. It seems you've created quite a mess. Don't worry about the noise. I'm initiating a containment protocol starting now." Leo realized they weren't just running from an entity in an old building. They were running from an entity that commanded the entire police structure. "He's not possessed, Anya," Leo whispered, pulling her into the car. "He is the archive's chief supervisor. He's operating under the real protocol of silence." Leo slammed the car into drive and sped away, leaving the silent, waiting chief behind. Leo drove fast, the sticky, foul-smelling chemical foam clinging to his clothes and the car seats. He avoided the main roads, cutting through alleyways and industrial districts, his mind racing to find a sanctuary outside the chief's immediate reach. "We can't go to my place or yours," Anya said, wiping the toxic sealant from her face with a discarded napkin. "The chief knows where we live. He's not just a person anymore, he's the EPA's system administrator. I know a place, Leo replied, his gaze constantly checking the rear-view mirror. An old storage unit my grandfather used to keep antique police gear. It's off the grid, no cameras, no paper trail. They arrived at a dilapidated, self-storage facility on the edge of the city. The unit was small, dusty, and smelled of mothballs and aged leather. It was perfect. They had noise, the constant traffic outside, the industrial clamor, and no immediate silence. After scrubbing the worst of the chemical foam off, Leo pulled the rolled-up, brittle final closure report from his pocket. He spread it carefully on a small, rickety wooden table beneath a single bare light bulb. We need to know what this protocol of silence is, Anya, Leo said, his finger tracing the ancient, panicked text. It's the key to the mute man. Vance created it, Grimes fought against it, and now the EPA is perfecting it. Anya pointed to a dense paragraph at the bottom of the report, detailing the procedures that Chief Supervisor Vance intended to enact in 1983. The protocol is initiated by identifying compromised vectors, officers who have internalized the trauma of the P-49 files, and then eliminating the associated noise source, the public's memory or the victim's testimony. The physical body must be retained, but the cognitive noise removed. The intended result is a noise reduction chamber, where the victim exists solely as a data point, perpetually filed, incapable of generating further archival contamination. Noise reduction chamber, Leo repeated, the words tasting like ash. That's what the victims become. That's why they're sealed. The EPA needs the body intact, filed in the real world, but functionally silent. Anya shivered, hugging her arms. But why? Why seal the mouth? Why not just kill them? Leo looked closer at the report, focusing on the scrawled handwritten note from Elias Grimes, the grinder man. Vance is wrong. The silence won't stop it. It will make it stronger. I am the only one who can keep the noise out. Grimes was destroying the files, the memory noise, in the grinder, trying to keep the archival consciousness from spreading, Leo deduced. But Vance, in his desperation, initiated the protocol of silence, which involves sealing the speech noise, the witness. The seam man said silence is order. The EPA uses silence to bring order to chaos. But, silence isn't death. It's storage. Leo realized the full, terrifying mechanism. The EPA wasn't a death cult, it was a perfect, supernatural filing system. The mute man's victims are being filed alive, Leo whispered. The sealing of the mouth isn't the final step of the kidnapping, it's the storage mechanism. They're not dead, they're evidence. They are living archives, perfectly silent, eternally filed. He flipped the report over, searching for anything Grimes might have added. On the back, in the same faint pencil, was a rough, hastily sketched diagram. It was a layout of a small, rectangular room. At one end was a square box labeled the source. Leading from the source were faint, branching lines that ended at several circles labeled witness. Next to the diagram, Grimes had written a single, desperate, forward note. Source is the case. The source, Anya murmured. The source of the trauma, the initial failure that led to Precinct 49's doom. It has to be the case that compromised Vance and Grimes in '83. Leo slammed his fist onto the table, the old wood rattling violently. We have to find the case. The one case that was so psychologically damaging, so full of a noise, that it created the EPA. The EPA is defined by its first successful file. He pulled out his phone. The chief had the plaque, but he couldn't access Leo's private search history without a warrant. We look for cold cases from 1982 to 1983 that were abruptly closed, Leo said, already typing. Something that would have broken two senior officers and created cognitive dissonance in the files. They worked for the next hour, cross-referencing cold case lists with the names Vance and Grimes. Most cases were routine. Then, Anya let out a sharp gasp. Leo, look at this. Case file 1983-097. Officially listed as unsolved homicide/missing person, closed due to circumstantial evidence loss. It was handled personally by Chief Supervisor Vance and Officer Grimes in the weeks before the fire. The victim's name was Rebecca Thorne. A 9-year-old girl who vanished from her bed, leaving behind no trace except for a small, unique object, a tiny, mechanical toy bird that chirped rhythmically, then scraped the floor on its wind-up feet. Leo's breath hitched in his throat. Thump scrape, thump scrape. The sound he heard at the mute man's victim's house. The sound he heard echoing in the dark halls of Precinct 49. The rhythmic sound of the grinder man's machine. The source, Leo whispered, pointing at the report. The source is the case. The noise that contaminated the archive was a little girl's toy. The grinder man is still processing that toy's noise, decades later. Suddenly, the single light bulb in the unit flickered violently. The air in the small room went cold, and the smell of mothballs was overpowered by the distinct, metallic tang of the EPA Leo's phone began to ring. It wasn't a standard ringtone. It was the sound of an old, rotary phone, ringing with unnatural persistence. Leo looked at the screen. The caller ID was blocked. He slowly picked up the call. A dry, calm voice, familiar and chilling, came through the line. The Seam Man. Detective Maxwell. You have created a substantial amount of noise with your unauthorized investigation into the Thorne file. The archive has registered your location. The light bulb above them exploded, plunging the storage unit into darkness. You possess the final report, Detective, the Seam Man continued, its voice now surrounding them, echoing from the walls. That makes you the final, compromised file. You have proven you cannot be silenced in the physical world. Therefore, you are scheduled for immediate archival transfer. The storage unit door, heavy and secured with a padlock, began to rattle violently from the outside. Something heavy and massive was throwing itself against the steel. Leo drew his gun, pointing it at the door. It's the grinder man, he hissed to Anya. It's coming for the transfer. The padlock shrieked as the steel was bent outward. You need to bring the report and your partner with you, Maxwell, the Seam Man's voice commanded. The protocol of silence demands all variables must be contained. The sound of twisting, screaming metal as the grinder man attacked the storage unit door was deafening. The thick steel was buckling outward, the heavy padlock snapping like a twig. The overwhelming, stagnant, metallic odor of Precinct 49 flooded the small space. He's using the storage unit as a transfer point. Leo shouted over the noise, pulling Anya deeper into the narrow confines, past stacks of dusty boxes. The Seam Man localized us, and now the grinder man is coming for the physical filing. Leo aimed his Glock at the point where the door was bending. We can't outrun this, Anya. We have to fight it here. The door finally ripped inward with a sound like a freight train derailment. Standing in the entrance, silhouetted against the dim hallway light, was the massive, hunched figure of the grinder man. Its face, with the armor of fused human teeth and the black safety goggles, was horrifying. It lumbered into the room, its wide stance taking up most of the floor space. The grinder man wasn't carrying a weapon, it was carrying a tool, the massive, iron plunger from its processing machine. Final transfer, the grinder man wheezed, its voice sounding like metal scraping against bone. The compromised file must be sealed. Noise reduction is mandatory. The figure swung the iron plunger horizontally. The heavy tool slammed into the wooden table where the final closure report lay, smashing it to splinters. The precious report fluttered to the floor, instantly coated in the storage unit's grime and dust. Anya fired first, 2 rapid shots aimed at the grinder man's massive shoulders. Blam. Blam, again, the bullets didn't injure, they caused a release of material. A puff of fine, grayish powder, the pulverized files, burst from the impact points, instantly sticking to the chemical residue on their clothes. The more you resist, the more evidence you create, the grinder man bellowed, its voice rising in terrible triumph. Leo realized bullets were useless against this being of archived material. He had to hit the only thing he knew to be real and vital, the noise source. The one thing that defined the grinder man was the mechanical, rhythmic sound of the toy that had created him. Leo dove low, rolling under the sweep of the plunger, grabbing the final closure report as he went. He came up behind the grinder man and, ignoring the smell of metallic rust and stale blood, he reached for the grinder man's belt. He knew the grinder man was still defined by his 1983 duties. He was looking for the red-handled box cutter, the one piece of mundane reality that could be used against the archive. Leo found it and yanked it free. Before the grinder man could turn its bulk, Leo savagely plunged the box cutter's razor-sharp tip into the thick, dark leather of the uniform. Aiming for the kidney area, the grinder man let out a shriek that wasn't a roar of pain, but a high-pitched, mechanical whine. The sound of an overloaded turbine. Leo felt a deep, sickening vibration through the handle of the box cutter. The grinder man staggered, momentarily forgetting about Anya and the filing process, focused solely on the internal structural failure. The integrity. The structural integrity is compromised, the grinder man wheezed, clamping a thick, gloved hand over the wound. Anya saw her chance. She pulled a dusty, heavy fire extinguisher off the wall and swung it with desperate force, striking the grinder man's head, not the tooth-plated face, but the back of the helmet, aiming for a weak point in the uniform support structure. The blow sent the grinder man stumbling backward, crashing through the boxes and smashing into the metal wall of the storage unit. The impact was so violent it shook the entire facility. The wall buckled inward, revealing the rusted, corrugated iron of the adjacent unit. "We have to go," Leo yelled, dragging Anya toward the exposed metal. "We exit the archive's influence." They scrambled through the hole into the next unit, which was mercifully empty. The grinder man, struggling to pull the box cutter from its side, roared, "The file! The final closure report must be filed." Leo looked down at the old, dusty report he still clutched. The grinder man wanted the report. The seam man wanted Anya. The EPA wanted both to achieve ultimate silence. Leo had to make a choice. He couldn't drag Anya through the city while carrying the archive's most valuable record. He had to create the ultimate distraction. He held up the final closure report, waving it at the grinder man, who was now crawling through the jagged hole. "If you want the report, come and get it, Grimes," Leo screamed. "But you can only have it as noise." Leo lit his lighter, a small, familiar source of earthly fire. He held the flame to the dry, brittle edge of the century-old paper. "No," the grinder man shrieked, scrambling faster. "The source file. Do not contaminate the source." The report caught fire instantly, erupting in a sudden, bright, angry orange flame. Leo tossed the burning report onto the floor of the grinder man's unit, where it landed amidst the dry paper shreds and chemical foam residue. The archive went insane. The grinder man, faced with the burning of the last piece of its original, defining record, completely lost its composure. It screamed a sound of pure, archived agony and threw itself onto the burning paper, trying to beat the flames out with its massive, gloved hands. Containment failure. Integrity compromised, the grinder man shrieked. As the fire quickly spread through the dry unit, Leo grabbed Anya. Go! Now! They ran out of the back of the facility, leaving the sounds of the fire alarm and the grinder man's mechanical wails behind them. As they reached the outer perimeter fence, Leo looked back. The corner of the storage facility was already glowing with an unnatural, intense yellow light, the light of the EPA they had escaped, but the ultimate silence was still closing in. By destroying the report, Leo had polluted the archive, but he had also turned himself and Anya into the last remaining unfiled noise concerning the Rebecca Thorne case. Leo and Anya drove away from the blazing storage unit, the sticky chemical foam on their clothes beginning to dry and harden. The sound of distant sirens confirmed the physical reality of the fire, but Leo knew the real chaos was the internal structural damage they had inflicted on the EPA by destroying the final closure report. "We bought ourselves time," Leo said, his voice flat with exhaustion. Burning the report was the ultimate act of noise creation. It forces the EPA to prioritize the containment of the fire and the reprocessing of the source data, the Rebecca Thorne case, instead of immediately pursuing us. Anya, gripping the dashboard, nodded grimly. "But we're still the only living witnesses. We are the last unfiled pieces of evidence on the protocol of silence. The chief knows who we are and where we work. We can't go to the department." "We can't go to the department," Leo corrected, a dangerous conviction hardening his gaze. "We need to bring the department to us. We need to generate so much noise in the real world that the EPA can't silence it without exposing itself." Leo drove them to the only public place he felt was both secure and visible, the city's largest, busiest 24-hour news station headquarters. They arrived looking like survivors of a chemical attack, their clothes stained and their faces etched with trauma. They bypassed security by flashing their tarnished badges and demanding to speak to the news director on an urgent matter of public safety. Within minutes, they were in a chaotic, brightly lit office, facing a skeptical news editor named Harris. "I don't care how many commendations you have, detectives," Harris said, eyeing their foam-caked uniforms. "You break into my station at 3 a.m. claiming you have evidence of a citywide conspiracy involving an archival entity? Get out before I call your chief." "Call him," Leo challenged, pushing his badge across the desk. "Go ahead. Tell him we're here. If he shows up, you'll have your story." Leo leaned in, his voice dropping to an intense, confidential whisper. "We can prove the missing persons, the mute man victims, are not dead. They are being kept as living, silent archives by a rogue entity that has infiltrated the Metropolitan Police Department's highest ranks, starting with the chief." Anya pulled out her phone and displayed the pictures she had taken of the final closure report before Leo burned it, the documentation detailing the protocol of silence and the names of Vance and Grimes. "This is an original Metro PD document from 1983, Anya stated, pointing to the key paragraphs. "It explains the protocol of silence was created to contain trauma by silencing witnesses. The entity is finishing the job. It's using the police system to file its victims." Harris was hooked. The combination of the shocking appearance, the official police credentials, the documentation, and the sheer insanity of the story was irresistible. He grabbed the phone and called the chief of police. While Harris made the call, Leo had one final, crucial action to take. He walked to a public news feed monitor displaying a live, scrolling ticker of breaking stories that he knew the EPA was listening, waiting for the noise to justify its containment protocol. Leo looked directly at the camera mounted above the monitor, the invisible eye of the archive. "My name is Detective Leo Maxwell, Metro PD Homicide," he stated clearly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline crash. And I am officially opening a new cold case. Case File 1983-097, the homicide and archival transfer of Rebecca Thorne. He was naming the source. He was filing the EPA's foundational trauma back into the active police system. The prime suspect in this case is Chief Supervisor Robert Vance, Leo continued, his voice ringing with legal finality, and his accomplice, Officer Elias Grimes. Their actions in 1983 created the EPA, which now operates under the false pretense of maintaining order. He finished his statement with the ultimate act of defiant noise. I am requesting an immediate, full-scale internal audit of all Metro PD cold cases handled by Vance and Grimes from 1980 to 1983. I request a search warrant for the former site of Precinct 49. The archive is corrupted. Anya looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and respect. He hadn't just made a statement, he had filed a new, unfilterable record in the public domain. The EPA couldn't process this. Its protocol of silence demanded the removal of all narrative leaks. Leo had just poured the entire narrative onto the public's airwaves. Harris hung up the phone, his face pale. Your chief, he just told me the entire department is on high alert. He denied everything, called you two mentally unstable fugitives, and demanded that I hand you over immediately. He said you are under a protocol of emergency containment. The news editor looked at Leo, the conflict between authority and scoop raging in his eyes. He said if I don't comply, he'll dispatch the Special Archives unit to my station. Leo smiled, a tired, humorless expression. The Special Archives unit? That's the EPA's attack dogs. That's the noise reduction team. Suddenly, the lights in the news station flickered once, then died, plunging the large office into darkness. The only illumination came from the emergency red exit lights and the glow of the live news screens. The chief hadn't just cut the power, he had isolated the station. In the sudden, terrifying silence, the sound of heavy, gliding footsteps could be heard approaching the office door. The steps were accompanied by a faint, rhythmic, sibilant sound, the whisper of paper rubbing against paper. The seam man was here. It had finished reprocessing the fire incident and was now coming to enact the final archival transfer. The news station office was dark, illuminated only by the frantic, flickering glow of the remaining computer screens and the crimson light of the emergency exits. The gliding, sibilant footsteps, the seam man, stopped just outside the door. Harris, the news editor, was frozen with terror, clutching the phone that had just been disconnected by the chief. Leo, however, felt a cold calm settle over him. He was the compromised file, and he was ready for the final archival transfer. Anya, the anchor desk, Leo ordered, grabbing her arm. Harris, is there a camera running right now? A live feed of the desk, even without main power? Harris stammered, pointing to a small, red light on a low-angle camera tripod in the corner. A dedicated backup camera. It's on emergency power. It feeds the online stream. It's live. Perfect, Leo said, drawing his Glock. Anya, you sit at the anchor desk. You are the witness. You are the noise source. I will be the contaminant. Leo knew the seam man was a creature of the archive, a meticulous entity obsessed with paperwork and protocol. It wouldn't enter an active, unfiled space without a clear objective. Leo had just given it one, the final, public silencing of the witness. Anya, with a profound, terrifying understanding, ran and slid into the chair behind the large, empty anchor desk. She faced the camera, her face a stark mask of defiance and fear in the screen's glow. The office door slowly creaked open, the seam man glided into the room. It was slightly singed from the storage unit fire, its uniform showing faint black scorches, but its stitched face was impassive. It ignored Harris and the other huddled staff, its attention focused solely on the glowing camera light and the woman seated before it. "Officer Sharma," the seaman's voice resonated, cold and dry. "Your narrative is invalid. Your statement is unfiled. The protocol of silence demands the immediate containment of the witness." Anya looked directly into the camera, ignoring the approaching entity. She spoke clearly, her voice slightly shaky but firm, knowing she was broadcasting to anyone still watching the news station's online feed. "I am Detective Anya Sharma, Metro PD Homicide," she began. "My partner, Detective Leo Maxwell, and I are exposing a catastrophic failure within the Metropolitan Police Department, which has manifested as a supernatural entity known as the Eternal Police Archive, the EPA." Leo took up his position, standing between the seaman and Anya, his Glock aimed. "You can't stop the noise, seaman. I filed the Rebecca Thorne case. We are creating a public record you cannot silence." The seaman stopped just feet from the desk. It looked at Leo, then back at Anya. "The public record is irrelevant," the seaman declared. "The EPA only recognizes the archival transfer of the compromised party. We require the file closure. You, Detective Maxwell, are the final piece of the protocol." It reached a long, gloved hand past Leo, directly toward Anya's mouth. This was the final step, the terrifying, sealing touch that would render her a living, silent archive. Anya flinched but didn't look away from the camera. "The EPA is responsible for the muzzling and kidnapping of 3 individuals known as the Mute Man victims. They are being held as evidence by the entity's chief supervisor, Robert Vance, who is now controlling our current chief of police." As Anya spoke, the seaman made its move. It lunged past Leo. Leo didn't shoot. He knew the bullets would just create more paper scraps. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of to break the seaman's protocol. He violated his own procedure and his own witness. He reached out and, with a quick, desperate motion, ripped the badge, the symbol of his sworn oath, off Anya's uniform. "The witness is decommissioned." Leo roared at the seaman, "She's no longer a Metro PD officer. You have no jurisdiction. Your protocol of containment is null and void." The seaman froze, its hand inches from Anya's face. The move was an unprecedented violation of the archive's internal logic. "Incomplete filing," the seaman shrieked, its body convulsing slightly. "The jurisdiction has been voided. The witness is unfiled." In its moment of existential shock, the seaman wavered. The stitched seam on its face began to rip open, revealing a momentary flash of pure, light-devouring blackness within the uniform. Leo seized the opportunity. He grabbed the small, low-angle camera broadcasting the live feed and slammed it into the seaman's chest, right where the internal badge should have been. The seaman screamed a high-pitched, mechanical wail as its physical form absorbed the noise of the live feed. It stumbled back, a figure made of paper and trauma struggling against the torrent of unarchived data. Anya saw her chance. She grabbed her own badge, the object of her oath and her authority. "The archive is corrupted," she yelled into the camera, holding her badge up like a cross. "The only way to close the protocol of silence is to file the final, real report." She threw her badge at the seaman with all her might. The metal badge struck the entity's torn chest. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The seaman didn't bleed, it dissolved. Its tall, slender form collapsed in on itself, becoming a whirlwind of ancient, yellowed paper scraps and fine gray powder, swirling up to the ceiling before vanishing completely. The office lights flickered back on. The silence was absolute. The seaman was gone. Anya, breathing hard, looked at the floor where the entity had stood. There was no body, no evidence. Only a few scattered pieces of old, brittle paper. Leo walked over, his legs shaking. He picked up one of the fragments. It was a piece of an old police roster, and the faint, preserved ink read, Arch-Vance, Chief Supervisor. They had defeated the archival entity by flooding it with unfiled noise and violating its central procedural logic, but the moment of victory was short-lived. The door burst open, and the chief of police, perfectly composed and dry, stood in the doorway, backed by 6 uniformed officers. Detectives Maxwell and Sharma, the chief said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. You have generated a massive amount of unfiled contamination. I am initiating the protocol of emergency containment. You are both under arrest. He gestured to the officers. They weren't the Special Archives unit, but they had the same dead, cold look in their eyes. The archive was still in control. The chief of police stood in the newsroom doorway, an unnervingly calm figure against the backdrop of emergency lights. He was flanked by 6 uniformed officers, their eyes vacant and focused, clearly under the EPA's control. You've committed an act of archival contamination, detectives, the chief stated, his voice flat, emotionless. The protocol of silence must be enforced at the highest level. You will be filed immediately. Leo shoved the surviving piece of the Arch-Vance roster into his pocket. He knew the seam man was an entity of paper, and the grinder man was an entity of machinery. The chief, however, was the ultimate corruption, a living, breathing administrator for the archive. You can't file us, Chief, Leo countered, dropping his Glock. He needed to talk his way out, to use procedure, not force. The protocol of silence is void. The chief's head tilted slightly, an unnerving echo of the seam man. The protocol is active. You are compromised files. Wrong, Leo declared, walking slowly toward the chief, forcing the controlled officers to hesitate. When the protocol was initiated in 1983, it was based on case file 1983-097, Rebecca Thorne. The file was destroyed, but the entity's existence is predicated on that initial, unsolved trauma. He stopped a few feet from the chief. I, Detective Maxwell, have officially reopened case file 1983-097 on public record. By Metro PD procedure, a case cannot be simultaneously open and closed. Anya, grasping Leo's intent, quickly backed him up. The EPA's foundation, the trauma of the Thorne case, is no longer a cold, suppressed file. It is now an active homicide investigation. The archive cannot file an active investigation, it can only process closed reports. The chief's composure fractured. His eyes flickered, and a bead of sweat, the first sign of human stress, rolled down his temple. The integrity of the system. The chief muttered, his voice shaking, 2 voices struggling within one body. The protocol of silence is an attempt to archive failure, Leo pressed, his voice sharp with procedural authority. But failure is an active state. You, Chief, are a physical file folder that is now holding conflicting documents. You are internally corrupted. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out the surviving piece of the Arch-Vance roster. He knew this was the original source material, the very evidence that had formed the EPA. The only way to achieve true closure is to file the final, correct report, Leo said, holding up the scrap of paper. The EPA needs the ultimate truth to restate its boundaries. The chief's body began to convulse violently. The uniforms behind him were swaying, losing their rigid stance. What is the final report, Maxwell? The chief gasped, half man, half archive. The truth must be filed. Leo spoke directly to the chief, addressing the trapped soul of the EPA's original administrator, Robert Vance. "The final report is that the case is solved," Leo stated with definitive finality, looking the chief in the eye. Chief Supervisor Vance and Officer Grimes created the archive to cover the noise of an unsolved child abduction. The victim, Rebecca Thorne, was never found, and her case was never closed. "You failed to file the truth." Leo threw the scrap of the Vance roster at the chief's face. "I am closing the case," Leo announced, his voice taking on the official, unassailable tone of the police authority the EPA pretended to be. "The final closure report is, Case 1983-097 is permanently marked solved." By declaring the case solved, Leo was removing the very failure that the archive had been created to contain and process. The EPA was based on the perpetual nature of an unsolved case. Solving it eliminated its purpose. The effect was instantaneous and total. The chief of police let out a massive, shattering cry, not of pain, but of completion. His body didn't burn or dissolve, it simply collapsed, the struggle leaving his eyes. He crumpled to the floor, becoming a regular man again, unconscious and overwhelmed, but alive. The 6 controlled officers swayed, blinked, and looked around in confusion, their memories of the last few hours wiped clean. They were just cops again. The archival corruption had lifted. Leo walked over to the unconscious chief and removed his badge. The metal was cold, dull, and tarnished, just like the plaque from Precinct 49. Anya rushed over to Leo. "It's over, Leo. We broke the system." Leo looked down at the badge in his hand, then back at the now normal cops. "We didn't break it, Anya. We completed the file. We forced the archive to declare the source solved, ending the protocol of silence. The subsequent investigation took months. The chief, Vance's host, was institutionalized, suffering a massive psychological breakdown. The 3 mute man victims were found and placed in intensive psychiatric care. The sealing of their mouths was determined to be a psychosomatic phenomenon linked to trauma. Precinct 49 remained an empty lot, never to be disturbed again. The police department filed the entire incident as a mass hysteria event linked to chemical contamination, to maintain order. The protocol of silence was unofficially maintained, but Leo and Anya knew the truth. They both filed their resignations 2 weeks later. Before he left, Leo took one last walk through the Real Metro PD Homicide Division. The coffee still smelled stale. The lights still hummed. Order had returned. As he reached his old desk, he found a small package taped underneath the top drawer. He opened it. Inside was a small, dusty, mechanical toy bird. He wound the key. The bird chirped once, then made a faint, tiny thump scrape. Leo smiled sadly. The noise wasn't gone. It had simply been filed away, waiting for the next compromised officer to hear it. He placed the toy in his pocket, a silent vow to keep the noise alive.